wouldn't let him go through, so he's got a long memory here. So in verse 3, he says, now go and smite Amalek. And this is the part that I want to key in on. And utterly destroy all that they have. And then if you skip on down, it says, slay both man, woman, infant, suckling, sheep, camel, ass. So when God gave the instructions for Saul to carry out, they were supposed to go and utterly destroy. What does the word utterly mean? Complete, everything. Now, if you will skip over to verse 13, Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed be thou of the Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Now, if you go no farther than that, if he said that he had completed God's commandment, what has he just told Samuel he did? Did what the Lord said. He utterly destroyed. But then when you get down to the next verse, Samuel said then, what meanest then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears and lowing of the oxen which I hear? So Samuel probably already knows the whole story, but he's looking at him, Saul here, and saying, well, if you did what the Lord commanded, what's all these sheep and oxen doing out here that I hear? We skip down to verse 16 where it says, Samuel said unto Saul, well, if you back up just a little bit, verse 15 covers what he had done. Verse 16, then Samuel said unto Saul, stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord has said to me this night. And then Saul told him to go ahead and tell him. When thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed thee king over Israel? So he's just reminding him here of who put him in the position and from what age. Verse 19, wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but didst fly upon the spoil and didst evil in the sight of the Lord? Like I say, Samuel knew because he had, I think he knew before he heard, but he just used the sheep and oxen as a way to ask the question. So he said, he asked him why he didn't do exactly what the Lord had said. And Saul said unto Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Was that part true? Well, as far as that goes, the people, but he didn't completely do what the Lord had said. And I have used this many times in past classes, and it's a good time to bring it up now. When I was a youngster growing up, I was taught that half a truth is a whole lie. So when Samuel or Saul here says, I have done what the Lord said, I've destroyed the Amalekites, he was telling a half truth. Okay. He is responsible, but we'll get to that just a little bit later. Yeah. Verse 21, but the people took of the spoil, the sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord. Now that Samuel has questioned him on it, and he has made that blanket statement that he did what the Lord commanded, now when he has found out that it wasn't complete and uttered the way the Lord had commanded, what is he trying to do? Transfer guilt, shuffle blame over to the people now. Calling it wiggle. Okay. And verse 22 says, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings. Now I love these next few verses here, so just bear with me. Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Now, Brother Cox had just said that Saul was in charge. Saul gives the direction. Everybody is responsible to carry out those rules and regulations or directions. Here, Saul is trying to put it off on the people that they didn't obey, and he's also trying to use some reasoning and rationale and says, well, they kept the best so they could sacrifice to the Lord. Now, Samuel, in his wisdom given to him by God, comes back and says, what does God approve of most? Obedience or sacrifices? Two wrongs don't make a right. The Lord wanted obedience, and it is evident that there was none. Verse 23, because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he also reject thee from being king. So by instructions from God, Samuel just let Saul know that you turn your back on God. He's removing you from that position. Verse 24, Saul said unto Samuel, I have sinned. And look at his rationale, the end of that. Because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. How often today do people stray and do the wrong thing because they give in to peer pressure versus doing what they know is the right thing to do? Why should Saul have given in to peer pressure? He was the king. Whatever he said was law. And at the time, he was in God's favor. So why did he feel it necessary to give in to pressure? A lot of times people want to do what makes people happy, and they want to be your friend instead of doing what's right. And in verse 25, Saul is saying, I pray thee pardon my sin and turn to me again. But in verse 26, Samuel told Saul, I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord hath rejected thee from being king over Israel. Now, aren't we told in the Bible that if someone repents that we are to forgive them? Why did Samuel not turn back to Saul at this time? Speculation, I know, but what would be a good reason that he would not turn back at this particular time?
There was words said, but I don't think he was someone who wanted them.
You don't know that for fact. I don't know that for fact, but Samuel was in touch with God. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and so, but with Samuel saying, no, I'm not going to turn back to you at this time, my personal opinion is that Samuel knew at this point, because he was in touch with God, that it was a hollow admittance of guilt. What happens today when somebody steps out and does something wrong and then immediately apologizes, as you see it in politics a whole lot, and in the news media a whole lot? Does it ever appear that they are genuinely sorry for what they did, or are they just, as Brother Cox said, mouthing the words to try to make peace? And then you hear these that will even want to hedge their apologies. Well, if I have offended anyone, well, why are you even apologizing if you're not sure you offended someone? So I kind of think that's what's happening here. Sorry they got caught instead of sorry for what they did. Absolutely. Then when you look at verse 28, well, in verse 27, Saul rent his clothes, and in verse 28, Samuel told him, "The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day." Now, renting of clothes just meant a separation, and here the kingdom is being separated from him. And in verse 30, Saul then said, "I have sinned, yet honor me, I pray thee, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and turn again with me, that I may worship the Lord thy God." So Samuel turned again after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. The second time that takes place, again, this is my opinion, but I believe that Saul, at this point, had seen the error of his way, and that Samuel knew that he was being sincere. So then he accepts him. And then when we get down to verse 35, it says, "And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel." So Saul was in God's favor at one point. Saul went his own way. Lord was sorry that he had put him in charge. Didn't the Lord, being the all-knowing, know that this was what was going to happen?
He had also told through Samuel what was going to happen before the king was even born.
Yep. Samuel had even talked to the people, telling them, if you get a king, these things are going to happen. And it happened in that fashion. So, but when God put him in charge, he let him go his own way.
And that was the best of the best, but not good enough.
Best of the best, but not good enough. Okay.
You take what you have, what you got.
Okay.
I think through arrogance and ego and being elevated, I think that humility left him and he became somebody.
Yeah, because if we remember, Saul was a little bit bashful, wasn't he? And what's that old saying? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay. Any other questions or comments then on chapter 15? Yes, ma'am.
And it also seems that when he repented, you know, he's just saying, please, honor me now before the elders and before Israel. It almost sounds like he's more concerned about, well, what does Israel think about me right now? Make sure that it still looks like a house, a little bit, than really concerned about what he is.
Good point. Anything else? 15. 16. And the Lord said unto Samuel, how long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thy horn with oil, and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. So God has chosen somebody to take Saul's place. Going to be from the family of Jesse. He's going to fill his horn with oil. Now the horn was generally used in those days, sort of like a cup, drink water out of, carry water. But here he's told to put oil in it. Why? Oil is for anointing. So, and that's the same way he anointed Saul So with oil. So here he is going to take oil with him to anoint the next one. Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hear it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with thee and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord." So even though Samuel wasn't going to have anything to do with Saul, if Saul knew that he was going out to appoint someone else, Saul was going to do something to him. As we get deeper into this in the next few chapters, we'll find out just what kind of animosity there was with Saul against the next one, David. Verse 3, "And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee." And Samuel did that which the Lord spake, and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming, and said, "Comest thou peaceably?" Why would the elders of a city tremble when Samuel, a prophet of the Lord, came into their midst? All right. Basically, that's it. Wasn't sure what he had in mind. So they asked the question, "Do you come in peace?" And he said, "Peaceably."
With them knowing Samuel, the father of God, that maybe God had sent him to do something for them.
Yeah.
Supposition.
Well, but isn't that the way they operated back in those days? They sent the prophet out to take care of things that needed taken care of. They just didn't know for what purpose he was there, what he was coming to take care of. Then he said to them, "Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. What does it mean in this verse here to sanctify? Pardon? Make pure? Okay, that's set aside for God's use is what the general term means here. But how do you do that? Let me do it this way. When you come to Bible study or to worship, is there a process you can go through to sanctify yourself? You're already, if you're a Christian, you're already sanctified or set apart. But when you come in to worship or study, is there a process that you can go through to sanctify yourself? Bingo. When we come to Bible study and Brother Terry stands up and preaches, what does he almost always do? Do you have your Bible? When you come to Bible study or worship, do we not, most of the time, generally bathe or make sure that we are physically presentable if we have opportunity? What about mentally, though? That is the most important part, is being mentally prepared for Bible study and mentally prepared for worship. If you come to worship and you're thinking about all the bills that you didn't get paid that you're supposed to pay, or what next week's work's going to be all about, or how busy I'm going to be, and how can I get things done, how can you expect to approach God and worship God if you've got everything on your mind except God? When you come to Bible study, if you have not at least read the lesson, how are you going to participate? How have you prepared? So I believe that that's what is talked about here. When he said sanctify Jesse and his sons, that just means that they were preparing to go to that sacrifice and do it in accordance to God's word. Verse 6, and it came to pass when they were come that they looked on Elijah and said, Eliab, and said, surely the Lord anointed is before us. So the first one of Jesse's sons that comes in is Eliab. And Samuel makes the comment, wow, this must be it. But look at verse 7. The Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh upon the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. How often do we judge someone by their appearance versus waiting till we get to know them? The Lord looks at the heart, not the outward appearance. Get to the New Testament. What are we told when it, in reference to somebody coming and worship in fine array and a beggar coming in off the street? What's our instruction in the New Testament on that? We're to treat them equally. We're not to give the man in fine robes the place of honor. We're supposed to treat him the same as we treat the one that's not as finely dressed. Again, in the New Testament, we're told that God is no respecter of persons. The only thing God is the respecter of is what? Actions, heart. What's in the heart and the way people act, not how they look. So we go through the next few there, and Jesse is calling his sons in one by one, and Samuel is being told by God or given information to reject all of them. And when we get to verse 11, it says, Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? That is a logical question, because if they have gone through every one of them that was present, and God had sent him there to pick out the next king, and it was going to be from Jesse's sons, would that not be the logical question? God's just refused all that's here? You got one in hiding someplace, or where, is this all of them? And then Jesse said, there remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he went and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and we're going to pause here on ruddy. Today, when we think of the word ruddy, what do we normally think of? Red face, blotchy skin, maybe. Old phrase that when I was growing up was as eat up with acne, or something of that nature. But ruddy here actually means something entirely different. And you can get that image that it's entirely different because the next part of that says, withal of a beautiful countenance. How could he have a beautiful countenance, appearance, if he was ruddy-faced? Those two don't go together. What the word really means is, what most folks think this word means is he was redheaded. He was redheaded. So he had red hair, had a beautiful countenance, he was goodly to look at, and the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. So out of Jesse's sons, he picks on the youngest one to be the next king. Now, if you'll notice here, things are a little bit out of sequence because David hadn't fought with Goliath yet. We'll get to that later. He hadn't had a bout here and there with the king, Saul, yet. So this is just sort of a synopsis of Saul, and then the transfer over to the next one, David. Yeah. Not there yet. Yeah. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So as soon as the process had taken place. Samuel had followed his instructions, anointed him with oil. Then the countenance of the Lord fell upon David from that day forward. Now look at verse 14. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Does that mean that the Lord said, going to take the good and give you the bad? It says from the Lord. Let nature take its course. That's a good answer. What happens, we have seen, or most of us in here have seen things like this happen. What happens when a good person stops doing good? What happens when a Christian stops coming to worship? Something's got to fill the void. Andrea reminds me often, nature abhors a vacuum. So if you're vacating one thing, something is going to take its place. So I believe, as Brother Cox said there, that God didn't send it, but since he removed the good from him, that it was going to be replaced by something, and that something then was naturally evil. Yes, sir.
God gave him that spirit, so God could remove it. It's not like he inherited it, it was his forever.
Right. Brother Clutch.
I think in this passage, I guess we see consistency or lack of consistency where people who are translating this, they make the choice whether you're going to capitalize the S or leave the lowercase as far as the S. They try to make it that way.
Yes, sir. They absolutely do. What Brother Clance was pointing out was that if you'll look at verse 14, most translations have it this way, or most versions have it this way. The Spirit of the Lord that was removed from Saul is capitalized, and the Spirit from the Lord that troubled him, or the evil spirit, was lowercase. So he's pointing out a lack of consistency here on the way the translators operated here. But as we go on through, and Saul's servant said unto him, Behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servant, which are before thee, to seek out a man who is cunning player on an harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. Before we go any farther, is there any truth to this? Sister Dot, you teach piano. You know music. There's a phrase that music soothes the savage beast. Is there any truth to that? To some extent, there has been study after study dealing with music. And if you ever notice, there's a phrase called elevator music. Why do you get in an elevator and you hear elevator music versus head banging rock and roll? It's a calming effect because you're in an enclosed area. They don't want people getting excited in an enclosed area. There's also been studies done at various institutions for those that are mentally, I think the PC word today is challenged. Music has a calming effect. Like I say, it depends on the type music too, but verse 17, Saul said unto his servant, Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. Then answered one of the servants and said, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and comely person, and the Lord is with him. So here's where we're getting a little bit like I said, this is a synopsis. We'll get more in detail later. But at the point that we're reading right now, was David a mighty man of valor, a man of war? When did he become a mighty man of war? Goliath down the road here. So we're sort of, like I said, just remember that this is a synopsis of it, and we'll get into details later. But wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, send me David thy son, which is with sheep. So they knew that David took care of the sheep. Well, I guess before we go any farther, here it said a man of war, and that's what I was keying on. But if you also remember when David was going to go and fight Goliath, it's told that he had fought other animals to take care of the sheep. So let's just make sure we get it all straight there. So at verse 20, Jesse took an ass laden with bread and a bottle of wine and a kid and sent them by David, his son, unto Saul. Okay, help me get this straight now. The king sends a messenger to you and says, send me your son. And when you send him, you decide that you'll take an animal and load him up with goods to take to the king. Why? He's been requested. It's not like you're going seeking audience with him. Customarily, when you approached, for whatever reason, some superior, you had to offer a gift. So here Jesse, knowing that his son was going to be before the king, sent him something. If you recall, in American history, what generally happened, well, I don't think it even takes place anymore, but used to, when dignitaries from other countries would meet with the President of the United States for the first time, what would happen? They would exchange gifts. Like I say, I'm not sure that takes place anymore. I hadn't seen much about it in the last few years, but yes, sir. Right. Right.
Don't know why the king sent for them. So you may be a little uneasy at that. You'll send your gift to God.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't say when the messenger got there that he told Jesse why the king wanted David. It just said send him. So good old dad, he's going to try to. When I was in the military, going into various meetings and all, we had a phrase that we would use that we would grease the sled. What that means is that 2 or 3 people that were going to be in the meeting had already talked about things, and they had the sled greased so that they could move the direction they wanted to go. They still do that. Very well could. Like I say, it does not say why the king, or that at least it's not written here why that they told Jesse what was going on. That's why, but what we're saying is that when the messenger got to Jesse and just told Jesse that the king wanted his son, I don't think it specifies that the messenger told Jesse why. And David, verse 21, David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. So see, this is the first indication that Jesse has that the king didn't mean him harm, that he was, and the why he had sent for him. Let him stay, he's found favor. Verse 23. And it came to pass when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So even if it's not true today, even if it is a placebo effect today, that music soothes the people, at least here it did. Whether it was divine or not can be left up to you. But personally, I believe that music does have a calming effect. Questions or comments then on chapter 16, and we don't have time to start 17. Luke is up counting, so we've got just a couple of 3 minutes here before the bell rings. Any questions or comments on anything up to this point then? That is sort of a open-ended, subjective type question, and even though he knew David was going to be the one, was David prepared yet for that role?
For what reason are all these kings removed? They normally aren't. That's the only way out of this. And so all are going to give up on it. So it's only until serious things like this happen that we no longer.
Yep. As Brother Clarence said, the only way out of being the king was death, and he didn't kill him off at that point, but he knew that he was disobedient. Which, now this just brings up something. This is an in general type thing to look at. We have looked at Saul. We'll start looking at David, and then we'll go to Solomon, the United Kingdom. Were any of those three perfect, or did they have some faults? All right, now when we get to the divided kingdom, and this is I've got numbers in mind, but depending on how you read and how you count and how you look at, I don't think they can come to a real consensus of total number of kings. But how many kings of the south were good out of all the kings that they were? How many kings of the north were good out of all the kings they had? None. So if you go number-wise and get in the 130 to 40 range of kings north and south, by my count, there was only 3 that were found favor with God out of all of those. So does this not go back to what Samuel had tried to tell the people? If you get a king, these are what's going to take place. And now out of over 100 kings, only 3 of them wound up to be found favorable to God. I find that kind of astounding myself. But anyway, any other questions or comments? Yeah, Brother Golden. And as we will learn later, all the time, look how many times David showed Saul that he could approach him and didn't want to harm him. In the cave, took a piece of garment from him, etc. So how come Saul was so dead set on killing him?
imminent, but he didn't know when. But he was not on as long as he could.
Well, I think it to be that people in power, a lot of people, when they get in a position of power, they constantly look over their shoulder, afraid somebody is going to. And you can go through some of the Romans. Nero. Why did Nero kill his wife and his son, and didn't want him taking over his power? So
See, too, that is the reason why most of the serve two times.
that's true.